Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutya Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Chaitanya Chandra Charitamrita Shuddha Sindhu Brindavaniya Surasarmi Samunimagna Jevai Jagan Nijagunai Swayamapunanti Tan Vaishnavangscha Harinama Parannamami. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama. Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano. Iha viharati Radha Krishna kunjadikari Tarubhaya rasarite Shuddha siddhanta dhari Sakala sujana geya Krishna dasa videya Paramakila gunanam Kaviraja kavinam Krishna dasa Kaviraja rasika bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Nahoilo Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janivera Serariti Shuni le borohoit. Shriyatam nityam giyatam mura. Chintyatam bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, a most graceful songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gora Lila, nourished with the nectar from Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, and Sri Raghunath, Sri Krishna Das, Kaviraj, Goswami Pad. Again, today we'll observe ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta, and we'll resume in the Madhya Lila, the Sanatan Shiksha, chapter 22, discussion of the Abhideya, and now you can say part 2 of that discussion, having discussed Bhakti as the Abhideya in the majority of the chapter. Now we're in the Prakaran on Sadhu-sanga, and we're unpacking Jiva Gosvami's statement that because Sadhu-sanga is the principal cause of attaining Bhakti, Sadhu-sanga itself can be called the Abhideya. So Mahaprabhu has, in the previous payar that we discussed in the previous class, said Krishna Bhakti Janmamul Hoy Sadhu-sanga, that the cause of the manifestation of Krishna Bhakti, or acquaintance with the path of Krishna Bhakti, is Sadhu-sanga. And moreover, Tehopuna Krishna Preme Janme Tehopuna Mukhya Anga. And moreover, in that Krishna Bhakti or Sadhan Bhakti, leading to the attainment of Krishna Prema or the appearance of Krishna Prema, Sadhu-sanga, which is also an Anga of Sadhana Bhakti, is the principal Anga or limb. So Mahaprabhu has cited a verse from the 10th canto to evidence this. So we're discussing that verse, and in particular, last time we read this lengthy passage from Bhakti Sandarbha Anucheda 180, where Jiva Gosvami establishes that not even Bhagavan, or the grace of Bhagavan, is the cause of bhaktas becoming acquainted with bhakti, or rather jivas becoming acquainted with bhakti such that they become recognized as bhaktas, but rather it is only the independent grace of the Sat, or of sadhus in the world, who are also free from suffering in samsara and thus not experiencing it such that they feel a commonality with those who are, but because, like the way one remembers the suffering they went through in a dream, sadhus also remember what it was like to be conditioned in samsara, and therefore feel compassion upon seeing the plight of those who are still very much in the plight of samsara. So out of their own will, they bestow grace upon them. So now we're going to look at some further finer analysis that Jiva Gosvami presents in a series of anuchedas that he adds after his discussion of the verse that we were discussing yesterday. So it follows through, so to speak. And then we'll conclude this commentary with a statement of Visvanatha Cakravarti that goes one level further, so to speak, or incorporates one further level of complexity and harmonization between statements made in various places of the Bhagavatam. And if we have time, we'll get into the second verse of evidence for the importance of Sadhu-sanga. So I'm picking up from where we left off, which was after this extended passage from Anucheda 180, which left off with a citation from 10.231 in the Bhagavat, where Sadhu or Bhagavan was described as, quote, Sat Anugraha, or he whose grace is the Sat, or that comes to Jivas in samsara only through the Sat. This was Jiva Goswami's interpretation of the compound. So, with that, I begin.
Prabhuji, just one quick question. Which verse are we on?
Verse 84 in chapter 22 of the Madhya Lila.
Verse 84. Thank you.
After, in this way, establishing that the association and grace of the Sat is the primary cause of jivas in samsara attaining intentness upon Bhagavan and bhakti to him, and that Bhagavan's grace comes to jivas in samsara through and as the grace of the Sat, Sri Jivapad expects that a further question will arise in the minds of many. That is, if Sadhu-sanga is the cause of attaining intentness or samukya upon and bhakti to Bhagavan, then what is the cause of attaining Sadhu-sanga? He thus further elaborates as follows. Quote, then the cause of Sat-sanga, furthermore, is only the independent conduct of the Sat, and not anything else, as he, namely Sri Narada, describes in the Bhagavat. Quote, once, independently, yadrichaya, they arrived at the sacrifice of Nimi. Meaning they, the 9 masters of yoga, arrived at the sacrifice of Nimi independently, that is, being self-willed, and not rather impelled by any other cause. Independence, or yadricha, means being self-willed, svairita, according to the Amar Kosh. Parameshwar as being an impeller in regard to the Sat, furthermore, is only in accord with the wish of the Sat. This is stated by Brahma in 10.14.2, quote, your body made up of, that is captivated by the wishes of those who are your own. And by Bhagavan himself in 9.4.63, quote, I am completely controlled by my bhaktas. So someone can say, Bhagavan is the fundamental enabling agent or, impelling agent of all activities. So how can you say that the Sat act independently? So he says, yes, they do, because Bhagavan only impels them to act in response to the will that they have. So it's really the will that they have that is fundamental. So this word yadrichaya, this instrumental form of yadricha, is found throughout the Bhagavatam to describe how bhakti is attained, as well as how sadhu-sanga is attained. Rupa Goswami repeats the exact same language in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu with reference to such statements in the Bhagavatam. So here, Jiva Goswami is rendering this idea of yadrichaya. Elsewhere in the Sindhu, it's referred to as kono bhagya or kena bhagyena, some fortune, And here that fortune is specified as the personal will of the bhakta. So it's as they wish. In other words, we hear so many accounts in the Puranas, in the Bhagavatam. Sometimes a person performs an act of arrogance or an act of disrespect in front of a sage, and the sage curses them, and the person undergoes, severe difficulty as a result. Or, as per the example that's given before in the previous passage, as well as the example ahead, sometimes the sages curse in a way that's actually a blessing. So, although the person disrespected them, still, by their own will, they bless the person such that they ultimately get bhakti. So when and why does a sadhu in some case wish to curse as a curse rather than curse as a bless? That's up to him or her. That's the independent will, or this svairita or yadricha on the part of the bhakta. So it is said that Sadhu-sanga is the cause of attaining bhakti or becoming acquainted with bhakti, and the cause of Sadhu-sanga is the wish of the Sat. This is the progression of thought so far, so we're going to go a few further levels, so just bear that in mind. And then the unstated objection is, well, how are these sadhus able to have this will in the first place? Well, it must have been dependent on Bhagavan, because he's the ultimate inner regulator of all. So Jiva Gosvami says, no. Despite him being the inner regulator, he's only impelling them as per their own wish, because he's controlled by his bhaktas, he's captivated by their wishes. So it is actually, Jiva Gosvami wants to lean and push on this quote-unquote independent aspect, or this aspect of the personal will of the Vaishnava. Now, in light of this understanding, that if a cause of Sat-sanga has to be posited, then only the will of the Sat themselves can be considered the cause, an additional question can arise. What is it that inspires the Sat to bestow their association and grace upon someone by their own will? So you say, okay, he just felt like it. Well, why did he feel like it? What was it that inspired him to feel this way instead of that way? Therefore, Jiva Gosvami says, the grace of the Sat, furthermore, is produced just by the sight of plight in a living being, and is not dependent on honor for themselves, that is, on receiving respect, service, or otherwise from anyone, as was Sri Narada's grace upon Nalakuvara and Manigriva. So he's saying, oh, well, if the Sat just feel like it, that means they're only going to give it to people who worship them, or they're only going to give it to people who, have some transactional exchange that's in their favor. So does it just depend on who has wealth and, good upbringing and the ability to nicely respect sadhus? This would be the objection. And if that's the case, then the cause of getting the grace of the sadhu would be good fortune in the world, in the form of being born into a good family, in the form of having wealth, and therefore I have to do good karma. This would be the domino effect of that implication. So Jiva Gosvami doesn't want it to go there, so to speak. So he says, no, it's not that it's dependent even on them being honored. Rather, and he gives the example of Nalakuvar and Manigriva, what to speak of honoring Narada, they were, ambivalent towards him, they were disrespectful towards him, and still Narada blessed them. So it's not that the sadhus are inclined to help people just in a transactional way. Rather, it's their compassion evoked by seeing the persons in a state of plight, whether that's abject suffering, or it's embarrassing ignorance, or embarrassing arrogance, or what have you. Therefore, Sri Vasudeva describes this in 11.2.6. Quote, as they, meaning people in general, propitiate the devas, so exactly, that is specifically to that extent, the devas, administrators of karma, like shadows, that is moving in exact reciprocation, also propitiate them. Sadhus, however, are affectionate to the distressed. So he wants to draw a distinction here, meaning if you worship devas, then the extent of the worship you perform, the degree of sacrifice or yajna or homa or what have you do, the extent to which they're propitiated, then in a transactional, equivalent, measured manner, they administer your karma in proportion, the way a shadow moves in exact, conformity with the movement of the body that it's a shadow of. So he's saying, but sadhus are not like this. They're affectionate to the distressed. In other words, they act out of the well-being of those persons, out of compassion for them, and not in any kind of measured or transactional manner. Because, you could add to that and say, because it's impossible anyway. In other words, what can some, person stuck in the ignorance of samsara with nothing to offer except acts of their own ignorance and transitory wealth that isn't of any value to sadhus anyway? What could they offer that could be of value to the blessings that a sadhu can extend in the form of acquainting the person with bhakti, which is, the fifth purushartha, the ultimate purushartha, more valuable than all the wealth in the world combined. So, if there were a proportionality to the transaction, there would be no such transaction because proportionality is impossible. So it could only be out of compassion and out of affection that this is extended. Thus, sadhus being said to be, quote, affectionate to the distressed, indicates that they feel compassion for them. And Sri Jivapad's point here is that it is this compassion of the Sat, evoked by seeing someone in a troublesome condition, that inspires them to give their grace and their association of their own will. Another question can also arise. So here we go, another layer of analysis. Is a certain degree of purity required for someone to receive the association and grace of a sadhu? So you might say, okay, the sadhu could feel compassion for the person, but does the person have to have some patrata, as it said, or some particular capacity to receive that grace? In other words, if some compassionate teacher of calculus comes along and says, I want to teach this person calculus, if the person doesn't know geometry or algebra or addition and subtraction, there's no good to teaching them calculus. They're not going to be able to receive it. They're not going to be able to grasp it. So similarly, if the sadhus are going to come and teach this profound spiritual thing, if the person has no means to receive that, then how will that happen? So is there some level of purity, some level of preparation required in the recipient? As Jiva Gosvami does say elsewhere, that speaking of the paradharma, that is known only to the 12 Mahajans in the 6th canto, he describes it as durbodh, meaning difficult to understand. And moreover, then he glosses difficult to understand as being dependent on what he calls ashaya shuddhi, or more commonly spoken of as chitta shuddhi, or a particular degree of purification. So elsewhere, Jiva Gosvami does say that to understand what is Bhagavad Dharma, or the paradharma taught in the Bhagavad, and that is shown and practiced by the Mahajans, there is required a certain degree of chitta shuddhi in order to understand it. So yet here, when the question is raised, is a certain degree of purity required? Jiva Gosvami says no. So how is there not a contradiction between these two statements? I'll explain in a minute. So first of all, in this case, he says, because of Sat-sanga alone being the cause of the greatest sanctification, a person also has no necessity of another cause of sanctification for that purpose, i.e. for the sake of attaining Sat-sanga. Since Sri Krishna says, quote, are places made of water not tirthas? They are. Are figures made of earth and stone not deities of devas? They are. They certainly purify a living being over the course of a long time. Sadhus, however, purify just by sight, that is, immediately, and should thus be considered the greatest of tirthas and the greatest of devas. So there's a well-known pada of Thakur Mahashai, where he says, Darshane pavitra koro etomar gun, that speaking of the Vaishnava, saying, this is your quality, you purify just with your darshan. So I don't know what was in the mind of Thakur Mahashai the day he wrote that pada, but I've often thought that perhaps he was inspired by this statement in the Bhagavatam to write that, where it says, sadhus purify just by sight. So the underlying point that he wants to make here is that there's nothing more purifying than sadhu-sanga. So it is possible for someone in a state of complete covered overness, if you will, to come to ultimately understand the path of the paradharma, meaning the path of Bhagavad Dharma, follow it, reach its goal by the influence of the purifying effect of sadhu-sanga. There's no specifically necessary other method of sanctification required. It is possible, so to speak, to start from scratch, whatever your condition may be in samsara, having by great fortune come into the association of a capable sadhu. But we can just add in a practical sense, that doesn't mean that that has to be the case, or that having some degree of purification already doesn't work in your favor. It certainly does. In other words, if you're in a highly tamasic state, if you're in a highly uncultured, rough state where you're highly prone to act disrespectfully, to commit offenses, etc., then even if you get sadhu-sanga, you may have a tough go. So having had some previous purification of the citta already certainly is beneficial and certainly is possible by other means. But Jiva Goswami's point here is that, is it compulsory? Is it that it can't happen otherwise? And he wants to say, no, it's not that it has to have been otherwise, because if it did have to be otherwise, then his whole crescendo here to establish sadhu-sanga as this independent cause of bhakti wouldn't work. It would then be dependent on what can do the prerequisite level of purification. That would also then come as a cause. So he wants to exclude anything and say that sadhu-sanga is ultimately, independently, the ultimate cause of both bringing bhakti to the person as well as purifying the person of the elements that are anathema to bhakti, if you will. So the point that I referred to earlier, where he says that Bhagavad Dharma is durbodh, or difficult to understand, because it requires chitta shuddhi, doesn't contradict this statement, because such a person who might initially come into the association of a sadhu who lacks much chitta shuddhi won't understand it, but it's gradually through the effect of that association that their chitta can be purified, and that they gradually will develop capacity to do so. So in that way, the two statements can stand. Sri Jivapad's point here is that there is no requisite degree of purity on the part of a recipient to receive association and grace from a sadhu, since such association is supremely purifying, and thus capable of purifying whatever impurities may exist within those whom the sat meet and grace. Okay, so this is as far as Jiva Goswami takes the subject in that section of the Bhakti Sandarbha. But now we're going to go one level further, so to speak, or we're going to raise one more Purva Paksha to, hammer in the post, if you will, which is clarified and addressed by Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad in his commentary on a statement in the first canto, and is also something that he touches on in the Madhurya Kadambini in very similar language, but his discussion of the subject in the Sarita Darshani on the first canto is a little more elaborate, so I've given that as the reference. So the final Purva Paksha is as follows. Finally, in this regard, there are statements in Srimad Bhagavatam, such as the following, that describe bhakti as being causeless. With bhakti manifest by bhakti, one bears a haripalating body. that is, attains prema bhakti and experiences sattvika bhavas, such as horripilation. And, quote, that dharma because of which causeless and unobstructed bhakti to adhoksaja, namely Bhagavan, can come to be, and by which the self, meaning the mind, becomes fully satisfied, is alone the highest dharma for humanity. How are statements such as these, which describe bhakti as being causeless, to be reconciled with the point made in the previous payar, the verse under discussion, and the aforementioned explanation of Sri Jivapad, that Sadhu-sanga is the cause of inclination towards and bhakti to Bhagavan? So, we've got all these points pushing for Sadhu-sanga being the cause of the appearance of Krishna bhakti, and so forth. And now over here, you've got the Bhagavatam itself, right in the second chapter of the first canto, saying bhakti has no cause. So Krishna bhakti janma mool, the word mool or root is synonymous with cause. And even if you look in dictionaries, one way that there's even a dictionary entry for the word mool is cause, and is used that way even by some of our acaryas in some cases, and is used in that way in the Bhagavad itself. So, to say that Krishna bhakti janma mool, that there is a cause or a root to the appearance of Krishna bhakti, would appear to be contradictory to these other statements that say that bhakti is ahaituki, or animita, without a cause. So how to reconcile this apparent contradiction? Here comes Visvanatha Cakravarti. So personally, I think this is a grand analysis which threads together everything very nicely. So we'll dive into that. Furthermore, so now he raises everything that we've just discussed as a purva paksha. Furthermore, quote, Sadhu-sanga is certainly the well-known cause of bhakti, should not be stated. Yeah, you read that, not. So he's immediately saying, nope, this whole point that was just established with all this analysis by Jiva Gosvami, not sufficient. So, Sadhu-sanga is certainly the well-known cause of bhakti, should not be stated as an objection to the principle that bhakti is causeless, because of even that, namely Sadhu-sanga, being an act of bhakti itself, on account of its being stated to be the second stage of the self-manifestation of prema bhakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Quote, first Shraddha, then Sadhu-sanga, then Bhajana Kriya. And because of the still to be explained statement ahead as well in the Bhagavad 1.2.16, O Brahmanas, taste for discussion of Vasudev shall come about as a result of service to a Mahat. So what he's saying is that you can't say Sadhu-sanga is the cause of bhakti because Sadhu-sanga is bhakti. Or just to boil it down, right? He's saying because Sadhu-sanga is itself an act of bhakti, to say that when you say that X is a cause of Y, typically the implication is that X and Y are not the same thing. But if Sadhu-sanga is an act of bhakti, then Sadhu-sanga, if you say Sadhu-sanga is X, then you're essentially saying X is the cause of X, because the two things that you're describing are both as both a general and a specific form of the same thing. So this is, in a nutshell, how he does it. But we'll look a little further at the way he flushes it out and why he takes this viewpoint. Furthermore, quote, the grace of Bhagavan alone is the cause of nirguna bhakti, should not be stated because of infinite regress, or what's called anavasta, occurring when the cause of that, namely of Bhagavan's grace, as well is to be sought out thereafter. So, we don't need to elaborate on this because we heard also already Jiva Goswami's analysis of the topic. So he's saying you can't say that the grace of Bhagavan is the cause because then you're going to ask for another cause and then that's going to be the grace of Bhagavan coming through the Sat, like Jiva Goswami just explained. So then you're back to the same question in the first place, or what Jiva Goswami in some places elsewhere calls mourning at the toll station, meaning you went a roundabout way to avoid having to pay a tax and ended up back at the same spot having to pay the same tax and much more tired as a result. So then he raises another one. Furthermore, that, meaning Bhagavan's grace, is the sole and purely unconditional cause of nirguna bhakti, should also not be stated because of the inference of partiality in Bhagavan that occurs on account of its not actually being existent everywhere. So he's saying, and so one argument against the idea that it's Bhagavan's grace is that then you get infinite regress. And the second point is that, and also it raises the problem of it then implying that Bhagavan shows partiality, or in other words, it's favoritism, or in other words, exclusion of some type, which then you'd come up with some ism, like now we have sexism, racism, these different topics. So if Bhagavan shows grace only to this or that, then Bhagavan's going to become a so-and-soist, because he doesn't grace, such and such person, and instead graces others. So that's problematic. So I've just explained this a little bit. Because Bhagavan's grace is not seen to be present in everyone everywhere in equal measure, one would infer that Bhagavan favors partiality in his bestowing of grace if his grace alone were considered the cause of the attainment of bhakti. So not everyone gets grace to the same extent, so we have to explain that inequality or that lack of even distribution, so to speak. And if you say that Bhagavan's grace is the cause of everyone getting bhakti, then that uneven distribution he's held responsible for that. So Chakravarti Pad doesn't want to hold Bhagavan responsible for that. That would imply a fault. So that's another reason why he won't posit the grace of Bhagavan as the cause of attaining bhakti. Moreover, the statement, the grace of a bhakta alone is the cause of bhakti, has no sort of disharmony. Okay, so he a minute ago said that you can't say Sadhu-sanga is the only cause of bhakti because Sadhu-sanga is itself an act of bhakti. But now he's coming back to that and saying the grace of a bhakta alone is the cause. Okay, then he's saying, okay, no disharmony with that. It's not a problem. Even in the absence of partiality in topmost or uttam bhaktas, on account of the observance of partiality to indeed exist in the character of an intermediate bhakta, as per the description of them in 11.246, quote, one who fosters prema for Ishvara, friendship with bhaktas, grace towards the unknowing, and disregard towards the inimical, is an intermediate bhakta. So he's saying we have precedent in the Bhagavatam for bhaktas of an intermediate grade showing partiality, so we can connect the partiality shown by intermediate bhaktas to the uneven distribution of grace in the world and in the form of the opportunity to take to the path of bhakti. So in that way, if you say that bhaktas, and specifically bhaktas of that grade and their partiality, are the main cause of persons becoming acquainted with bhakti, then he says, no disharmony. In other words, he's not fully accepting it, but he's not saying that it's a faulty idea either. Therefore, furthermore, because of Bhagavan's being dependent on his bhakta, Bhagavan's grace manifest as a result of following the grace of his bhakta is the cause of nirgun bhakti, is the conclusion, or the siddhanta. So, bhakti comes from Bhagavan, it's his Shakti. Bhakti is the Ladini and Sangvit, combined essence of the Ladini and Sangvit vrittis of Bhagavan's Sarup Shakti. It's his thing, so it's hard to completely exclude him from it being extended to others. And Jiva Gosvami does say in Priti Sandarbha 65 that it's Bhagavan who casts it into bhaktas. But what we're talking about now is not just that it comes from Bhagavan or it's ultimately granted by Bhagavan, but what is the cause of someone getting it? Then he wants to say that it's the grace of the bhakta and the wish of the bhakta for the well-being of the other that evokes the dispensation of it from Bhagavan to that person. So now one final point of analysis, an objection is raised. Well, then how has bhakti's causelessness remained? In other words, if you go along with this line of thought that it's the grace of bhaktas that evokes the grace of Bhagavan, that leads to the attainment of bhakti, then there's no fault in that understanding. But how does that now match back with what's said here in this verse of the Bhagavatam, that bhakti is causeless? So he ties everything together as follows. To this it is said that the causelessness of bhakti is verily established, because of Bhagavan's grace being contained in a bhakta's grace, because of a bhakta's grace being contained in association with a bhakta, and because of association with the bhaktas being a limb of bhakti itself. That is, bhakti's causelessness is established because of bhakti's being its own cause. Insofar as the cause of the attainment of bhakti, namely associating with a bhakta, is also an act of bhakti itself. Moreover, the cause of a bhakta's grace is the bhakti residing in the heart of that bhakta. Because of the non-existence of the possibility of graces arising in a bhakta's heart without that is, without the bhakti present in their heart inspiring the bhakta to willfully bestow grace upon someone. Therefore, indeed, in all respects, the cause of bhakti is bhakti alone. Thus, bhakti's causelessness, or nirhetukatva, is established. So, very, genius here, Visvanatha Cakravarti, not contradicting Jiva Gosvami at all, nevertheless, following his line of thought, sustains and, integrates a further level of subtlety, if you will, or, discusses these points, discusses this notion of bhakti's causelessness in another way. If you look at Jiva Goswami's commentary, he takes the description of Ahaituik in another direction, or he glosses it in reference to two different actually aspects of bhakti, some of which we've discussed on other occasions. So Chakravarti Pad here, looking at causelessness in a more conventional sense, and then adjusting that in harmony with Jiva Goswami's previously stated viewpoint. So yes, it's Yadrichaya. Yes, it comes just by the will of the bhakta. Yes, Bhagavan's will is dependent on the bhakta. But it's also the bhakti in the heart of the bhakta that is also instrumental in their will and in their compassion towards the others. As we discussed earlier in the list of the qualities of Vaishnavas, one of them was compassion. So if that quality of compassion is a quality of a bhakta, if it's an outcome of bhakti, then even that will, which is inspired by the compassion, is fundamentally inspired by the bhakti. So in that way, it's bhakti itself spreading itself to another by evoking compassion in a bhakta, such that the bhakta prays to Bhagavan to send it, bhakti, to the other person. So in that way, we can say bhakti is the cause, or we can say bhaktas are the cause. And Bhagavan has a causal role, but does so, participates upon request, if you will, of the wish of bhaktas and the, agency of bhakti. So, in summary, the act of bhakti known as Sadhu-sanga, that is association with the bhakta, whose will even Sri Bhagavan feels compelled to follow, is the cause of the bestowal of Krishna bhakti upon a jiva in samsara. Because the grace of Bhagavan, to whom bhakti belongs, follows the grace of his bhaktas, they in whom bhakti dwells, and a bhakta's grace is attained through a bhakta's association, granted by the personal will of that, bhakta, as a result of bhakti's inspiration from within the heart. So that's as far as we have discussion of the verse from the Bhagavatam, the first evidence that Mahaprabhu is citing for the idea that Sadhu-sanga is the cause of the appearance of Krishna bhakti. So next we'll go into introduction of the second verse that he cites to evidence this point, but I'll just pause here in case anyone has any comment, question, correction, or otherwise on the discussion of this verse. Yes, I see a hand.
Pranam, Pranam Prabhuji.
Pranam.
So, uh, this is my first time attending. So, just pardon my, ignorance. Right? I'm just. My question is specifically about uh, the point that you made about how Sadhu-sanga and is basically yadrichya, and how mercy manifests on its out of its own accord through the devotee. Now here in 179, Anusheda 179, the Devas, they make a prayer. It's in 3545, right? So it's the famous prayer where they say Tanvai Hyasat Vrittibir Akshibir Ye पराहृतान्त मनसः परेशः अथो न पश्यन्ति उरुगाय नूनं येते पदन्यास विलास लक्ष्य. So here when Jiva Goswami translates this, he says asad vrittibir, he interprets asat vritti as offensive. He interprets the word asat as offensive, and this is because in that same Anucheda or somewhere earlier, Maitreya actually tells Vidura in 3.5.3 that devotees go about the whole world spreading their grace. This is in Janasya Krishnad Vimukhasya Daivad. So my question is here, asat is not taken to mean bahirmukta, because by definition everybody is a bahirmukta. So grace can never come to a devotee, to anybody, right? Because they're all bahirmuktas. But here Jiva is saying very specifically that if someone is offensive, the devotee will not give the grace. And that is my question, is generally when people meet a sadhu, they are, many times they are offensive. They are offensive either to the sadhu themselves, or they are offensive to other Vaishnavas, or they are offensive to the name or whatever, right? Does the grace actually depend on that? Because Anucheda 179 and Anucheda, in that same Anucheda, there are two alternate options given, and I can give you the actual verbatim what Babaji has said in that too. So what is your take on that, Prabhu?
Well, we discussed that in the last class. That whole passage was there in the previous class. And so there, the example is given by Jiva Goswami of Narada's grace upon Nalakuvar and Manigriva. So they committed aparad, right? They were, arrogantly, disregarding of him naked and all this in front of him. So despite the fact that they were transgressing the code, despite the fact that they had, this arrogance because of their wealth and so forth, Narada still blessed them. So from that, we can understand that there isn't a guarantee that a sadhu will grace someone who commits offense, but there isn't a guarantee that he won't either. In other words, yadrichaya, it's his own wish. As I mentioned earlier, there's accounts in the Puranas of sages cursing people and the people suffer. And there's also accounts of them giving them what we call in English blessings in disguise, where it's a curse, but it actually turns out to be a blessing, just as in the case of Nalakuvar and Manigriv. So, yes, that if someone has an inoffensive mentality or has, good upbringing and knowledge of how to be respectful and so that's definitely a big advantage, But at the same time, Jiva Goswami wants to say it's not ultimately compulsory, because then that would create a philosophical problem, if you will. So we can say he's being very broad in his analysis so that the philosophical thread is tight, if you will, or consistent, but we don't necessarily need to take it that therefore there's no practical utility to already having some degree of chitta shuddhi or some degree of inoffensive behavior ahead of time. Definitely that's good. It's just not ultimately philosophically absolutely necessary.
Okay. So then between these two Bhagavatam statements, I think I can conclude that the second one, which is through by the Devas to which the devas speak, is actually of lower, what is it? It's lower in the logical order than the first one, which is spoken by Vidura, where he says devotees go around the world and they spread the glories. But your point is, it is independent of the fact that whether they are offensive or not. It's always good to be nice and courteous and so on, right?
Yes, and as was explained there, that Jiva Goswami also took the second statement as a general disposition. In other words,
Yeah.
sadhus don't just intentionally spend their time with a bunch of severely offensive Bahirmukha people. It's not that's where you're going to find sadhus spending their time. But
Yeah.
there, Narad is walking on the path and he sees these people. It's just an encounter, and it happened like this. So there's a general norm that persons who engage in a bunch of anti-devotional conduct, speech, etc., are unlikely to be visited by, unlikely to get the opportunity to have sadhu-sanga. This is certainly a general truth, and that's why the statement was made. But it's not that it's a ultimate, complete barrier to entry, because sadhus can still ultimately end up somehow meeting someone and end up being kind even to those who are not kind to them, because sadhus are sadhus. Sadhus are so wonderful.
Yeah. Actually, my next, thank you. That really helps. That was one clarification. The next one is actually about the devotee's free will in giving their grace. And you cited the 10.14.2, Now, this shloka, 10.14.2, which is, it actually comes in this Asyapi Deva Vapusho Mad Anugrahasya. This actually comes in 3 other places in the Sandarbhas. It actually comes in Krishna Sandarbha Anucheda 102 and 177. And this Swa Ichchaya Amayasya, here in 181, Jiva Goswami translates it as by the desire and will of the devotees. So this indicates devotees have free will. But in the other place where Brahma's prayers, where this is in the Krishna Sandarbha, he basically is translated it as by your own free will. So it's 2 very distinct answers. One where in that context, he explains it as, where Brahma is making these prayers, Jiva Goswami is saying that Brahma cannot possibly comprehend the two-handed form. And then he says this form was self-revealed by the will of the Lord. Interestingly, this same shloka comes in 177 as well, and then later on in Krishna Sandarbha only, and then later on here. My question is not so much about the technicality. I mean, there are both opinions are given here, whether it is by the will of Bhagwan or by the will of the devotee. My question though is that when we see, statements like this in the Shastra, where 2 distinct possibilities are given, and both are given in the Sandarbha itself, right? As devotees, what is the right disposition while we read this? Because the author has some intent in mind, and he has taken one shloka, shown 2 different sides of it. Now, when we as sadhakas, when we read it, can you guide us on how should we be interpreting this, in what light? Just so we ourselves can make progress. That's the question.
Relish it. There's a nice verse of Baladeva Dibhushan in his commentary on the Stavamala, where he describes Rup Sanatan as holding up the jewel of Govinda as if they have him in their hand, and then gradually showing you this facet, and then this facet, and then this facet, and then this facet. So there's so much potential and so much scope of meaning there in the Bhagavatam. And the Goswamis have brought out that, as we're studying now in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the whole premise of the discussion is this Bhagavad Bhakta Shastra Sar, right? That Sanatan says, I've perceived this essence of the Bhagavad Shastra in Chaitanya Dev, and I'm now, conveying that through this text. So they've perceived that essence, and then they're going about conveying that essence. So no doubt there can be multiple intended senses or multiple intended meanings of compounds and statements in the text. And so where and when that's appropriate, they're bringing that out. From a reductive epistemological perspective, you could also say that they want to establish a precedent for the community of their followers in the future that praman is always given from the Bhagavatam or another text for any significant philosophical conclusion they make. So they meticulously do that. And in some cases, you might call it a little bit of a stretch, or to say that to take your praman from a compound which is open to a range of interpretation from a reductive or a critical perspective is obviously not the strongest type of praman. In other words, it's not a shruti statement, it's requiring some level of interpretation. However, we see that that wasn't a problem for Jiva Gosvami, or in other words, if there are cases where he wants to bring out a particular principle, but there isn't a direct literal statement of that principle in the text, but he's come to collectively understand that this is what the text wants to convey, then in some cases he's using a compound as a precedent for a principle because the compound can convey that meaning, although someone might argue that it doesn't have to or definitively does. We as his students, certainly take his word as an authority, but we don't claim or we don't necessarily ask everyone else to do so. But for us, that's more than enough. And it, keeps up this ethic of showing praman from the Bhagavatam and of relishing the Bhagavatam in the course of bringing out this framework, this whole analysis of Sambandha, Abhideya, Prayojan, and so forth. So it's, a testament to their brilliance. It's a testament to how much they cared about you, how hard they worked, how deeply they thought, so that we, fortunate people hundreds of years later, could come along and say, wow, and grasp this profound spiritual path that they've laid out and this highly relishable content of the Bhagavatam that they've made accessible through that. So we can, sing with joy about our lucky stars.
Yeah. No, wonderful. Thank you very much. Actually, this really helps me just put this in context. And just one last question. I had asked this to Babaji also, but he says in the class on Anucheda 180.2, he says that Sat-sanga actually means physical, face-to-face association. And obviously now we are associating, but we are, this is not we don't get any chance. Many of us are so far away from each other, right? How do we understand this? Like, I made a note of this in my notes because Babaji emphasizes this, that it has to be physical. Of course, later on he has said in other classes that virtual is kind of accepted. But what is your view on this? How do you see this?
Well, I'd say my first and main thought is that there's a special experience that is only possible when you're in the personal proximity of a person. That's special. I can say in my life, I've had relationships with people that I've never known, only online, and I've also had experiences of talking to people that I know on the phone or through a Zoom, and then I've also had the experience of being with them in person. And there's something special and relishable and some, not to use flowery language, but some kind of exchange of energy or some kind of transaction that can happen between two people when they come into the same physical space. So I took it from the way Babaji Maharaj spoke about that topic, that he wanted to preserve some respect and some regard for the power of that, because there's a pro and a con, as the Bhagavatam says, every resolution to a problem creates a new problem. So, this technology that we have, which enables us to communicate to some extent virtually, solves a problem to some extent, but it also can create the problem of, because we can associate online, why bother meeting in person? Because we have this facility, there can become a de-emphasis upon the most important or the most effective type of association. So to balance, you could say, the problem created by the partial solution, this emphasis is also important to retain. And especially for persons who may not have had that experience for themselves, then it's important to encourage them to seek it out. And at least in my experience, when you have some wonderful experience in the personal company of a sadhu, nobody needs to argue with you that that's valuable. That's very valuable. You can cherish that as some of the best moments in your life, you know. So, you know, once you have that experience, it, at least, you know, in my experience, it becomes obvious that I would have been severely lacking of something if I never had that.
Right. So you're saying that when in this verse, this prior verse, which was talking about association with sadhus getting their grace, the most preferred one is just try to do it in person, because that's obviously, as you just said, it has a more direct correlation with you and it leaves you with an experience and a samskara which will go on for a much longer time. Because with online, it's very difficult to get that. I mean, it's very difficult to get that kind of connect. You know, I mean, it's kind of more impersonal that way. Thank you very much, Maharaj.
All right, well, I think we're about out of time for today, so I'll hold on jumping into the next verse. So we can conclude here, and in our next reading, if we're so blessed by Sriman Mahaprabhu, we can proceed into discussion of the ensuing verse then. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Thank you, Babaji. Thank you.